Alrighty, so in the last lesson, we installed CocoaPods and we added the Alamofire framework. Okay, so Alamofire is a library that is built on top of URL session to kind of make it easier to use. So let's go ahead and take a look at it in its GitHub. So I'm going to open up a new browser and I'm going to search for Alamofire. And if we go to their GitHub page here, and remember what I said about looking out for lots of stars and well-maintained, check out Alamofire. 28,900 stars, 5,000 forks. And as you can see here, it's pretty well-maintained. The most recent looks like a month ago, so pretty good. Now, what we want to take a look at here, I would highly recommend going through and familiarizing yourself with their documentation. What you'll want to see is right here under usage. So if we come here, then what we can see here is how to make a request, all right? So just a refresher on how URL session works, we create a data task where we pass in the URL that we want to download data from, and in the closure, in the response, we get back data, a response, and an error. And these are all optional, okay? We do a check to make sure that the error is nil before we proceed. Then we get the data. Then we turn that data into a JSON object that we cast as a dictionary, okay? So that's kind of how the URL session went. And now the Alamofire is pretty similar, just a little bit simpler. So if we take a look back at the documentation here, it says making a request. First off, we need to import Alamofire, okay? So that is importing the library so that we can use it. And right here, it says alamofire.request, and then you pass the URL, and that's pretty much making a request. However, we want to be able to handle the response as well, obviously. And so what that does is we chain a response handler onto the request. And so it's going to look something like this. Alamofire.request, you give it the URL, and then you say .response JSON. This means that we expect the response to return in the form of JSON. And then here in the closure, we get the response. So this is different from the URL session because they have data, response, and error, three different parameters. This is all bundled inside just the single response. And then you can get to the other things by saying like response.request, response.response. If you want the JSON, you say response.result.value. Okay, and this is how we can get the JSON and check for any errors. There are some other response handlers here that shows, let's see, is it here? The response. They have responses of type, here we go, data handler, string handler. So if you expect the data to come back as data, if you expect it to come back as a string, we already talked about JSON. And you can even chain together different response handlers. Now, I'm not going to go over everything in here. There's too much, but you can see that you can specify the different types of methods. So I would highly encourage you to go through and read through this and kind of get a handle on what is available. We are going to keep it pretty simple in this section and just use pretty much right here. We're going to do a Alamofire request, pass in a URL, and have a JSON response returned. Okay, so let's get to it. I'm going to jump back into Xcode, and I'm going to leave all of the functions that we write in here, just so you can have a reference back to them. I'm going to go ahead and make a comment here. I'm going to say web request with URL session. And then up here, I'm going to say web request with Alamofire. So the functions are going to be similar. So I'm going to copy the URL session one. I'm going to paste it here. And then I'm going to delete everything here in the middle, okay? So we still have the name of the function, getRandomPerson, but we're going to change this to Alamo so that we don't have a conflict here. We are still going to be passing in an ID, a number, and we still have our completion handler, and we still have our URL. All right, but from here, what we first need to do is import Alamofire, right? So I'm going to say import Alamofire, and this is what you'll do whenever you import a Cocoa pod. You'll need to import the pod to use it. Just like you would need to import UIKit or Foundation or Core Data or whatever library that you're wanting to use that isn't part of the standard either Foundation or UIKit. All right, so then we can say Alamofire.request, and there are several options. We want, let's see here, this one right here, data request with a URL. And then we're going to pass in our URL that we have right here. And then we're going to add our response handler, right? So I'm going to say .response, and we want response JSON. And it says here, this adds a handler to be called once the request has finished. And in the completion handler, we're going to get a data response. So I'm going to press enter and then press enter again, and then name this response. And then we can go down to our code here. So first thing that we're going to do is do a check to make sure that there isn't an error. So we're going to say if let error is equal to response.result.error. That's how you can get to the error for this response, for this network request. So if there is an error, then we are going to go ahead and print it out. I'm actually just going to copy what we have here. We're going to print out the error. We're going to complete with nil, and then we are going to return out of the function. And we're just going to have to do a localized description right there. All right, so we know that there's not an error. So now let's go ahead and get our JSON. And we're going to do a guard let JSON equals, and the way that we get the JSON from the response is it's inside of its result.value. So we just say response.result.value, and says this returns the associated value if the result is a success, nil otherwise. So we need to have our guard let, and we're going to again cast that as a dictionary of key string type any. And if that doesn't work out, then we are going to return with a completion of nil. Very good. And then, just like we did before, we can initialize a person object with self.parsePersonManual and pass in the JSON dictionary, and finish this off with a completion of person. And then just do a little bit of cleanup here. And that looks pretty good. All right, so let's jump into our select person VC, and instead of calling get random person URL session, let's call get random person Alamo. There we go. And let's run that and make sure that's working. All right, so clicking on random. There we go. Still working the same as it did before. Very good. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at the differences here. Let me close this bottom view. And one of the big differences is that obviously, instead of having these 3 parameters, we only have it all bundled inside of one response. The nice thing is that we don't have to do this do cache because we don't have to deal with this JSON serialization. We can cast it directly from the response.result.value to a string dictionary. And we also don't have to have this task.resume that's already handled for us. Okay, so it's much more succinct and looks nicer. We don't have as much code that we have to write. And so that's one of the nice things about Alamofire. It abstracts some of the clunky parts of working with URL session. And where it really shines is when you have to do some more complicated things like adding parameters, bodies, headers, doing uploads and downloads of large files and that kind of stuff, all right? So hopefully we can have a section later on where we dive into some of the more complicated parts of networking and using Alamofire. But for now, this is our new get random person request, and we are going to stop using this one. But I'm going to leave the code here just in case you need to reference it later. For example, if you go to a job interview or something where they say that you need to do network requests, but you can't use any third-party libraries, you have to use URL session, then you'll have this to be able to reference, all right? So hope you enjoyed this lesson, and in the next lesson, we are going to replace our parsing function to use Swifty JSON. All right, so I'll see you then.